So I see that we are now okay, thank you. I'd like to call to order the May 18th, 2022 meeting of the Planning and Economic Development Committee. One brief note on the agenda. I just want to make sure people know that item 4B, the Tompkins County Homeless Needs Assessment, is not a voting item. That should be no under the voting column. Before we start our meeting with public comment, I do want to say something that this has been a very painful week for our community and our friends in Buffalo. On Monday morning, we sent a letter to the mayor of Buffalo, and I just want to read that. Dear Honorable Mayor Brown, our community stands with residents of Buffalo as you grieve the loss of life from Saturday's racially motivated murder of innocent citizens. Our hearts are with the people of Buffalo, especially the families and victims of this racist hate crime committed by an individual who is not from Buffalo, the city of good neighbors. Such a horrific act by a white supremacist should never be visited upon any community. We are grateful for the efforts of the TOPS Market Security Officer, Mr. Aaron Salter Jr., and are saddened by his death. We also recognize members of the Buffalo Police Department who arrived at the scene of this crime within 2 minutes when they engaged with the shooter and eventually took him into custody. While this terrible act is clearly a hate crime, it also once again raises the need to address access to guns and reasonable federal gun legislation so that weapons like that used against Black residents of Buffalo do not travel so easily from one state to another. Our deepest condolences to all those directly affected by this shooting and the residents of Buffalo at large. So I read that because it has been a painful week. I want people in my hometown of Buffalo to know that we are standing with them during this painful time as they will be looking at a number of funerals and trauma for residents in this community, which is largely a Black community in the city of Buffalo. So thank you for allowing me to read that. We'll now turn to public comment. And Debbie, I believe there is one member of the public here to comment. And I see that Zach Wynn is joining us. And Zach, just a reminder that you have opportunity to speak for 3 minutes, and we'll give you a heads up when that 3 minutes is over. So please go ahead.
Oh, am I speaking right this second? All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I had a chance to read over the plan for dealing with the illegal homeless encampments. And my question is, if drugs will be allowed on site, what options will be available to people who wish to get or remain clean and sober? And will there be 2 separate camps? And if so, how will that affect the viability of the project? And also, I'd like to know, if drugs are allowed on site, what will prevent drug dealers from competing to deal drugs to the occupants of the camps? With property crime, with drug addiction, crime surrounding drug addiction is principally involving property crime and the violence between rival drug dealers for the opportunity to deal those drugs. And I'm curious if the viability of providing free or low-cost drugs to drug addicts in a controlled environment, specifically ones not contaminated with fentanyl, could break the economic life cycle of drug addiction and rob the black market of the cash, which fuels not only the day-to-day life of an addict, but also is such a lucrative trade for drug dealers. And I know there are federal laws that would prevent the distribution of Schedule I substances to people who do not have legitimate medical need. And I believe it would be possible to classify long-term opiate addiction as a medical condition and treat it as such. Also, consider the fact that there are meth addicts who are occupying these camps, and they are not particularly known for their rational thinking or ability to be kind of corralled into a controlled environment. And I could see this project, leading to other issues if not handled properly. So I'd like to encourage you all to look at the work of a gentleman named Michael Schellenberger. He is running for governor of California, and he's examined the similar situation in San Francisco. And I would just be very cautious moving forward, to make sure there aren't unintended side effects to this plan. So thank you very much, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Debbie, do we have any other public comment?
We do not have any other public comment.
Okay, thank you. Any response from committee members? Cynthia?
I do want to thank Zach for his comments. I hope that you will share them with me by email, because there is a lot of material that you included. The proposal for the sanctioned encampment site is actually not on the agenda, nor was it included today. All the policies regarding activities that would be monitored and regulated on the site, so to speak, is still up for discussion. I think our first and primary priority is to make sure that all of the residents there are safe, that the site itself is accommodating not only to the residents, but to the neighbors, neighboring businesses, and the community. We do want to make sure that we reduce any barriers for participation, but finding that balance, as you mentioned, is going to be a nuanced process and very thoughtfully done. Thank you for the reference to looking up Michael Schellenberger. I hadn't heard of this individual. I'll be happy to look into that. And again, please forward your comments by email so that we can take a look.
Thank you. Any other comments? Response? Okay. Let's move to our public hearings. We have 2 public hearings tonight. Is there a motion to open the public hearing on the 2022 POD action plan? Thank you, Patrick. Is there a second? Thank you, Rob. All those in favor of opening the public hearing? Thank you. I saw Phoebe on the Zoom, but I don't see her right now.
Yeah, she got cut off or
Okay.
something. So we'll let her back in when she comes back.
Yeah, Debbie, if you could watch for her in the waiting room. Thank you. And I understand we do not have anyone here for the public hearing. So can I have a motion to close? Patrick, and seconded by Rob. All those in favor of closing the public hearing? That's 4-0. Thank you. Next, we have a public hearing on the East Hill Fire Station, and I should mention that both of these public hearing topics will be discussed as we move through our agenda tonight. Could I have a motion to open the East Hill? Thank you. And a second, again, thank you, Rob. All those in favor of opening this public hearing? That's 4-0. Is there anyone from the public who wishes to comment on this public hearing? I don't believe anyone signed up. Okay, so a motion to close. Patrick and Rob, all those in favor of closing the East Hill Fire Station public hearing? That is 4-0. All right, thank you very much. And as mentioned, we will have these discussion on both of these later in the agenda. So now let's turn to our agenda item 4A, which is a presentation of an update actually on the West End. And I believe Eric Hathaway, the Director of Transportation and Parking, is here with us. Hi, Eric. So do you want to take it away?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen here. Just one second. Okay. Can everybody see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here because 10 months ago, I came to PEDC. I apologize, it's dark in this room. I came to PEDC to discuss some analysis that had been done in the West End, and really wanted to give everyone an update. Well, those who were on PEDC at that time, give them an update, and those who are new to council, to give them a little bit of history on the current situation. And so I'll go into first slide here. So the history is that there are two significant developments just west of Route 13 that came in several years back. And as part of site plan review, we took a look at traffic impact studies for both of these developments, since they're fairly large. And you can see here the number of intersections, 20, that we had the developer review to look at the potential traffic impact. And so out of that came some concerns from the DOT, because Route 13 is a roadway owned by the state DOT and operated by them, though it's in the city of Ithaca. So it really needs to meet their operational and safety standards. And so through that discussion, the DOT did some investigation of their own of ways that they could mitigate some of the traffic impacts. We brought that to PEDC, and I know there were lots of concerns expressed. And so since that time, we've done some additional analysis of our own to see if maybe we could still meet the DOT standards, but maybe accomplish a few more of the city's goals of what we're looking to do. And so I feel kind of hopeful that we're moving in that direction, but I want to give you a little bit of a background here on some specifically of what the DOT had proposed previously. So here you see Buffalo Street between Fulton and Meadow Street as it is today. You can see that there's obviously two directions on Buffalo Street, eastbound and westbound, and all movements are permitted there. And what the DOT had proposed, the most significant change, would be that Buffalo Street would become a one-way roadway for just one block between Fulton and Meadow. And that would accomplish two things from what the DOT had researched. One is it increases efficiency at the traffic signalized intersection of Fulton and Buffalo, because it reduces the amount of total traffic there. And secondly, they said it would accomplish the goal of improving safety, because Fulton and Buffalo certainly has one of the highest crash instances in the city. And one of the leading types of crash there is the southbound versus westbound movements colliding. So it was logical what the DOT put together, but I know Common Council and others at the city, including myself, were concerned about the wayfinding problems that may result from this and inefficiencies in getting around the city. And so so we did a little bit of further analysis here, and you can see that it's a significant amount of traffic that we'd be talking about moving, about 600 vehicles during a peak hour time, not insignificant. And our concern was that maybe instead of just solving the problem, we might be moving the problem around somewhere else. And it was unclear from the study exactly how much of that traffic might end up impacting Corn Street and Plain Street and other side streets as well. So multiple concerns here. And then of course, you'll see from the next slide that rerouted movement coming Seneca Street and then up Taganic Boulevard, there's about 240 feet or 260 feet of 240 feet of storage space and 260 feet of queued up cars is what was anticipated there at times. And that could certainly have a cascading effect of creating traffic problems throughout that area. So that was a concern that we had. The other thing that was on the table that the DOT had proposed was to make a change to the intersection of Buffalo Street with Taganic Boulevard. You can see here today the configuration of that intersection where all traffic movements are permitted. And what they proposed was to restrict left turn movements from Buffalo Street onto Taganic, the eastbound to northbound lefts and the westbound to southbound lefts. Now that's not a high number of vehicle turning movements at any given time, but the alternative for those vehicles is not very efficient. Of course, if you're coming eastbound on Buffalo Street and you want to go northbound on Taganic Boulevard and you can't make a left here, you have to go straight, make a right, make a right, make a right, come up through the intersection. Certainly inefficient, and we were resistant to that idea. So we had, with our consultant, Stantec, who's been helping us with some traffic related issues, let them take a look at this corridor and see if maybe there's another way we could address some of these safety issues specifically first that the DOT raised. And there were sort of three, I won't get into all the details, but there were sort of three general types of principles that we thought could certainly help. Signal heads, there's not very good availability or not very good visibility with some of the signal heads. It's some older equipment. A lot of it is oriented very close to the stop bar, which makes visibility a problem, which could explain some of the history of crashes that are happening there. Also, wayfinding was a big issue. Obviously, what was proposed there could be problematic from a wayfinding standpoint, but even what's there today is probably not as good as it could be and could lead to some sideswipe accidents and other things that we're seeing on the corridor. The third is finding a better way to transition speeds down southbound coming on Meadow Street into this area. So those were sort of the three things that we started to take a look at and had a dialogue with the DOT about. And in the end, what we've come up with as sort of a counter proposal to the DOT, which we presented to them 2 weeks ago, was, this is a very busy figure, I realize, but I'll talk you through it a little bit. In the end, we feel, and we've shown through analysis, that we could accomplish their delay and operational goals without having to make a one-way section on Buffalo Street, which was our biggest concern. We do have to restrict the left turn movements on Taganic Boulevard at Buffalo during peak hours. We think maybe even just during the evening peak hour, and it wouldn't have to be a full restriction. There's really no way to efficiently physically restrict that movement anyway, so it would probably be a signage situation. But it's become clear that in order to meet the DOT's operational goals, that really does have to happen. And after all, it is their roadway, as is 96 and 89 and Route 13. So, but we feel that by not, the DOT who's currently reviewing our plan does not require the one-way section on Buffalo Street. That's a really big win for the city and for wayfinding and probably for safety in the end too. The other thing that we have recommended here is that at these intersections that show a purple star around, that we do something that's called a leading pedestrian interval, because we've seen a lot of history here with problematic trends when it comes to bicycle and pedestrian crashes. And we feel like that's just as important, if not more important, than the angle crashes that are happening at Fulton and Buffalo. So for that reason, we found that even with the inefficiencies that a leading pedestrian interval, which essentially is giving a pedestrians a 3 to 6 second head start into the intersection, so they're more visible to cars who might be turning. But even with that, we have better efficiency than the current system just by restricting the left turns on Taganic Boulevard and also implementing a change that I'll show in the next slide. But we feel like that'll really be an overall improvement to the corridor and some pedestrian enhancements at other crossings too. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds here. But the other significant thing that we're proposing is that, and this is probably something a little bit larger project down the road. We currently have a grant to look at creating this area of Route 13 as more of a boulevard. And we're looking to basically north of the gas station that's located at the split in Route 13 as you come southbound near Purity Ice Cream, to basically restripe and probably put a curb up against the west, or that'll be the north side of the road there, to create a third lane further north than is today, and to carry that through as a shared through right all the way down to Buffalo Street, before Buffalo Street. At Buffalo Street, it would become a right turn because there's a significant number of right turns there. But we feel like this is a safer transition and also adds some capacity to the corridor and helps us meet the DOT's goals. And the last thing I want to add about some of our reasoning for what we've counter proposed to the DOT, going back to this slide, is that Teganic Boulevard itself, especially with some of the recent improvements, changes to intersections and development to the south, could be in the future a significant bicycle, part of the bicycle network. There could be some improvements there to add bicycle lanes. And if we were to reroute traffic per the DOT's plan with the one-way section on Buffalo and send a lot more people down Seneca and up Teganic, there's probably some widening of that road needed for the additional capacity for cars. And that's really problematic and really limits what we could do in the future for bicycles. So that's a further reason why we've taken these steps that we have. So that's just a brief synopsis of a very complicated and long history of what's been happening out there, but I'm welcome any questions that you have.
Questions for Eric? Cynthia.
Thank you, Eric. I hope this can be shared with council. I'd love to take a closer look at this and then also talk with you about it. I guess I'm a little confused. I recognize that the DOT's recommendation was to turn West Buffalo into one-way going east.
That's right.
So that basically it addresses something that I know happens, which is morning rush hour traffic gets backed up on Buffalo all the way up the hill. So that definitely would release that backup. But you're saying as an alternative, you would reduce turns on Buffalo and Teganic during the evening peak hours, which is an entirely different direction. That's when you actually have traffic going west, and you want to open up traffic going west. So I'm curious, is there any accommodation in here that would also deal with what was originally proposed, which was to address the morning rush hour traffic, which is traffic going east?
So the morning peak hour, you're saying that because there's some queuing that happens in the eastbound direction, is there something that can be done to improve that as well?
Well, I'm saying that the original remedy would have addressed the eastbound traffic in the morning, but the proposed remedy addresses the westbound traffic in the evening. So is there something that's being incorporated to address the eastbound traffic in the morning?
Yeah, well, I would say the original proposal from the DOT to do the one-way section eastbound, I don't even know that necessarily added a lot of capacity to the eastbound direction. It was really more to improve efficiency at Fulton and Buffalo. So I would say what's on the table now with two-way isn't necessarily would cause any more eastbound delay than their proposal was. I can't say that definitively. I could look more closely at it, but yeah.
No, and I agree with you. The pinch point would not be relieved by turning West Buffalo or that section of Buffalo into a one-way. Yeah. So I guess since we still have the problem of draining the eastbound traffic in the morning, I'm hoping that might be something that could be incorporated into a proposal, because that is definitely a consideration. I do appreciate recognizing the inefficiencies that the original proposal would have resulted in terms of like all of the roundabout circular connotations that would have to be done. one of the things that I had wondered about, and I wondered if was considered, was surge lanes considered at all? When you take a lane and then in morning rush hour, it's one way, and then in the afternoon rush hour, it's the other way. And then you have that additional flow. And that's also comes down to signage and training, which also might address some of the very issues that we're working on here.
Yeah, no, that wasn't something that we looked at. I don't know. I don't know if of Region 3, if that's something that they're open to in their roadways or not. We can certainly talk to them about that. I don't know if there's a precedent for them doing that in this region. But I think it's a complicated enough problem. And I think we all recognize that there's significant delay there that, out of the box thinking is certainly welcome. So yeah, we could bring that into the equation, but no, we haven't looked at it specifically.
Thank you. The last question I have is, you had talked about a leading pedestrian interval. I don't really know what that means. I know that when you press the button, the light changes. So what does a leading pedestrian interval look like?
Sure.
And how does that help?
Yeah. So what it does is basically, it can be done at intersections where you have to push the button or ones when you don't. But essentially, instead of the green light coming on for traffic first, the pedestrian walk indication would come on 3 to 6 seconds before. And so, you as a pedestrian would be able to get 3 to 6 seconds into the intersection before any other traffic can move. And what research has sort of shown is that it just makes you more visible as a pedestrian and eliminates some of the confusion where you're coming off the curb at the same time as somebody who wants to make a right turn in front of you. But by getting 3 to 6 seconds ahead, you may already have gotten halfway through the intersection. So if you've completely eliminated some conflicts and others, you've positioned yourself in a way that drivers should be more aware of you.
So just as a clarification, are you still open to right turning traffic that might turn into a pedestrian that is now given the turn or the walk signal first, or does the whole intersection come to a stop for 3 seconds before one direction is allowed to flow?
Right. Yeah. So no traffic is operating during those 3 to 6 seconds. It's a head start that's only for pedestrians that go first.
Okay. So everything goes red during those three seconds. All right. That right. Yeah. I understand now. Okay.
Yeah. So that's why
for example,
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. For example, Cynthia, a good illustration of this, we worked with Eric, and he worked effectively in getting the lead pedestrian interval at the Day and Meadow intersection. Yeah. And that has proved to be helpful because that's a major access point to get to the waterfront trail, to the Ethical Farmers Market. So it does make a difference. I hope that we will be successful in pushing for a minimum of 6 seconds. 3 seconds, especially for someone on a bike, someone pushing a stroller. 3 seconds is a bit too brief. So if we have opportunity to encourage the longer LPI, I think it would be helpful. I think there's also an LPI at Meadow, right at Aldi's at that cross as well. But as Eric is pointing out, it's where all vehicular traffic are stopped. People on bikes and strollers, rollerblades, have that opportunity to get into the intersection, so they're seen by traffic.
Okay, thank you. I did have one last question, but I'll go after Rob.
Okay,
Rob, please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Eric, for this. Is really helpful, and I'm happy also to see that that one block of Buffalo Street is remaining in a two-way. I think that's really helpful. My question is about the restriction on left turns for Tagonic Boulevard. I'm trying to follow the pattern for someone who, and I granted, I know this is probably done more with signage than it is in any kind of physical restriction, but for someone who is following those rules, coming eastbound, so they can turn right on Tagonic Boulevard, And that would that be the pathway they would follow to eventually go north on Taganek Boulevard?
No, I think most people would probably go straight through the intersection, turn right onto Fulton, turn right onto Seneca, and turn right onto Taganek to do that.
Okay, so it would be that one square block detour, basically.
Yeah. Yes, okay. It's pretty inefficient, and that's why we would hope that it would be, only during certain times of the day, and especially on weekends. I feel like a higher percentage of the traffic on the weekends is probably making that maneuver, just because of parks and things like that are up to the north. So it's not fully determined, but I think it's only been proven that it's very effective in the PM peak hour, just because of the high amount of traffic on the roadway.
And going the opposite direction, I guess the goal would try to get them to turn on Fulton before they even get to Taganek.
Right. Yep, that's correct.
And that's more of a signage issue because that puts them pretty far out of the way to cross the bridge.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure I understood that correctly. Thanks.
Yeah. And I'm glad to hear that first of all, I'm glad to hear that you have a strong working relationship, Eric, with the DOT. So I have two questions. One, will the changes that you're working on, will it satisfy DOT in relation to the City Harbor and Carpenter Park developments? That's one question, and then I have another.
Sure. Well, I guess I should say all of this, is up in the air. It's an open conversation right now. We've brought this new analysis to the DOT a couple of weeks ago. We've had ongoing conversations with them. But really what we were able to present a couple of weeks ago was a lot of new and helpful information. I spared you about 30 slides worth of information that we shared with them. We wanted to prove as thoroughly as possible that this is a good idea. So that's still, I guess, technically up in the air. But your question was about, sorry, can you
the development? Will
yeah.
these changes satisfy the needs of the developments?
Right. So that's an interesting complication of this whole project that I'll try to be as efficient as I can in explaining. So last time that we came to PEDC, what was on the table is because the Cayuga Park development needed a break-in access to Route 13 in order to basically be viable, especially from an emergency response standpoint. And so at that time, it was tied up at that time, the DOT was requiring these changes to be a mitigation that the developers had to do in order to mitigate their impact. But as time went on and the DOT took a look at this option that they had looked at, they liked it just from the standpoint of something to address even existing concerns. And because they already had a project that was lined up and funded within the next couple of years to resurface and restripe this area, they basically created additional funding for that project to do this work. So then it's no longer tied to mitigation of the development itself. So it's sort of changed the whole dynamic around these improvements. So we've really tried to work with the DOT, understanding. Yes, sweet. Sorry, I have my daughter just popped in for 1 second. I'll be right back with. Yes, sweet. Okay.
I'll just add from what Eric was saying that it wasn't just the break-in access, but also we asked that both projects to install very significant pedestrian and bike improvements on Route 13, and that was also what we wanted DOT to approve.
That's helpful. Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah. Okay, I'm back.
So Lisa, do you want to just repeat the comment you just made?
Yes, I just added to what you said, Eric, to say that as part of site plan review and mitigation for the traffic, as the city, the planning board, and coordination with transportation engineer or director of transportation, Eric, in other words, we required pretty extensive pedestrian and bike improvements on Route 13, and DOT needs to approve those too. So in addition to the break-in access.
That's right.
Thank you. Cynthia, did you have another question?
Yeah, my follow-up question had to do with adding a third lane onto
Mhm.
Route 13. And you had mentioned that this third lane would be added, yes, in that area. Was it, I mean, one thing about having 3 lanes, it does seem less pedestrian friendly. It is much more of an intense environment. Then it would go from 3 lanes down to 2 lanes again. So is that considered to improve flow, or just to create another sort of resting space for cars as they make their way down Route 13 South?
Yeah, it's a good question because, something that was discussed from the beginning with the DOT when we couldn't meet their operational standards was, there's always a question, do we expand the roadway? Do we make it wider? We said, by all means, no, please, let's not do that. That's not what we're trying to do in the city. We're trying to make things safer and more efficient for pedestrians, bicyclists, and all users. But in this case, some years ago, there was a situation where Route 13 southbound was laid out differently. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but it did create a situation where there was some more weaving and back and forth. And with this particular proposal, where the 3 lanes basically flows into what's already the existing configuration further south of here. So it basically transitions that a little bit further north. And I think as part of the long-term build project here to make this more of an urban boulevard, it's a more natural speed transition in this area. And you can barely see it here. I apologize in this graphic, but basically in the orange section is where the taper begins for that lane. And so it's actually, I think, it's less confusing for vehicles. There's an opportunity to do more advanced wayfinding there and get people in the position where they want to be earlier. So I think where in principle, certainly I'm not for making roadways wider, but in this particular instance, I think it's going to minimize sideswipe type crashes. And so I think it's actually worth it. The other thing is that instead of being a roadway with a shoulder, it would be with a curb most likely. And so it's going to create a little bit more friction and slow those speeds naturally. So I think the trade-off is a net positive, but I think you're right to ask the question.
I mean, it seems that if we were able to keep the 3 flow lanes all the way through down Route 13 South, because what happens is we have 2 forward lanes and then right turn onlys.
Yeah.
So then if you're not turning right on Buffalo, you're not turning right on State, you still have to snug back into those 2 lanes. And if it were to continue through that way, that might be helpfor.
Yeah, and that's where I've had some conversations with Stantec and the DOT about that. There's some considerations with there's the emergency preemption for the railroad there, that sometimes having a separate right turn lane at Buffalo and other places can be good from a safety standpoint. And I know Buffalo has a very high right turn volume there, but we may still investigate a little bit if that through right could continue further. But I think years ago when that was the configuration, there was some problems with people getting in and out of lanes and having some side swipe crashes, the DOT pointed out. So yeah, but I think that is potentially on the table too, that this could carry further even what we're showing here.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Rob, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks. Again, as we're talking about this section, Eric, at one point, I think you referred to it as some kind of boulevard, or that's the approach we're looking at. Remind me, was there ever any talk about doing some kind of median in the middle that might offer a sort of midpoint respite for pedestrians? Or I know that further north, I guess it's not at 3rd Street, it's probably after Day Street. It does provide that break between northbound and southbound. And was that ever considered in this area as well? Is there enough space there for that?
Well, and I should say, just to clarify, with all the things I'm showing in this slide here, this wouldn't be something necessarily, this wouldn't be tied to the existing DOT restriping project. This is more of our long-term through the build project that Tim's managing for a long-term improvement. But I think that's the exact type of concepts that are being considered. We're not far enough along in that process to say, and some of the mitigations for the City Harbor project are exactly that we've required is more of a median pedestrian refuge type of design. So I could see, I would anticipate that would continue in the future through this area of the corridor. Yeah.
That was required for both City Harbor and Carpenter Park and the Breakdance.
That's right.
Median refuge on.
Okay, good. I thought I remember that conversation, but that would be helpful there. And I think it does help when you're not, if you're trying to cross 5 lanes versus 4 or 6 lanes versus 4, having that respite is good.
For sure. And it's just more inviting. We're developing this area on the other side of Route 13, and we want to encourage people from Fall Creek and other places to be able to want to make the trip on foot or on bike instead of through the vehicle if possible. So if it looks more inviting, that's hopefully going to help us.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Good questions, everyone. Are there any other questions? Okay. So Eric, what now is the timeline? Will you be able to provide us with another update, and in what amount of time, if so?
Yeah, so it's a little bit undetermined how long of a period of time the DOT is going to need to process what we've given to them. Like I said, it's a lot of information. It probably will take them a number of weeks, I would think, at least, because it has a very large impact on their design project that they're looking at for the resurfacing today. So I don't know. We'll have some follow-up conversations with them in the coming weeks, and I'll probably have a better sense of when we'll be able to know definitively if they're willing to go this direction. But I'll certainly keep everyone up to date, and I'll be back to provide that information once I have it. But I don't think, they're they need to move their design project along, in order to get it implemented on time. So I don't think there's any benefit to them to taking too long with their review.
Okay, thank you so much. Really
Sure.
informative.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on. Next, we will welcome Liddy Barger from Human Services Coalition, and once again, let me just remind the public and the committee, this will be a presentation. It is not a voting item. But Liddy, thank you for the slides you've sent along, and I'll turn it over to you for the presentation on the Tompkins County Homeless Needs Assessment.
Great, thanks. Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Liddy Barger. I'm actually going to turn it right over to Simone Gatson. She's sort of kicking us off today, my colleague at the Continuum of Care, and I'll be checking in just a second. Simone.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to share the presentation real quick. So hi, everyone. My name is Simone Gatson. I work at the Human Services Coalition as a housing specialist, and I'm staff for our Continuum of Care. I'm also the coordinated entry lead for New York 510 or Tompkins County. And I'm obviously here with Liddy Barger. She's the Director of Housing Initiatives at the Human Services Coalition, as well as the coordinator for our Continuum of Care. So today we're presenting on a needs assessment that was commissioned by Tompkins County, the City of Ithaca, and our Continuum of Care from Lisa Horn from Horn Research, to really kind of look at the gaps and barriers in our homeless response system in Tompkins County. So she generated that report that we shared. These findings and recommendations in particular were those that were highlighted by our COC governance committee that we wanted to share. So although we weren't able to capture all of the elements of the report in this presentation today, these are the ones that our governance committee found to be most salient for this presentation. So, great. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to start off with some definitions and methodologies so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. And then some data. Liddy will chime in on the recommendations, and then we'll open it up for questions. So first, I just wanted to start with the mission of our Continuum of Care. So in case you weren't aware, the Ithaca Tompkins Continuum of Care, New York 510, is a local community planning network of public, private, and nonprofit partners. So everyone from housing providers to street outreach to city planners, anyone who has an interest or some kind of stake in our homeless response system, we invite in. With a mission of making homelessness rare, brief, and one-time in Tompkins County. And there's a few ways that we meet that goal. First is by organizing organizing that community-wide effort to prevent and end homelessness. So we have regular meetings as a part of our education arm. We also have committees. We also manage our county-wide homeless management information system, which is kind of a live database about who's experiencing homelessness now in Tompkins County. We also provide funding and support to nonprofit agencies. So we're the collaborative applicant to HUD for a lot of our supportive housing funding. And then we also support access to supportive housing, supportive services and housing. So like I mentioned, I'm the coordinated entry lead. So coordinated entry is a system where we can maintain a wait list for all homeless individuals to get access to the supportive services that they are best suited for. So that's a little bit about the continuum of care and why we're giving you this presentation today. And just some definitions to get started. So how do we define homelessness? In our continuum of care, we follow HUD's definition of homelessness. So when we talk about literal homelessness, we're talking about people sleeping in a place not meant for human habitation. So outside, in a car, or in our emergency shelter through DSS. Individuals who are fleeing domestic violence are also considered homeless, but this doesn't cover people at risk of homelessness. So people who are doubled up, couch surfing, people who have to leave their residence are not included in our definition of literal homelessness. We define chronic homelessness, which will come into play when we talk about the data, as someone who has a disabling condition and has been continually homeless for at least 12 months, or has had 4 or more occasions of homelessness that are totaling 12 months. And again, these are all HUD's definitions. How do we define permanent housing? This is just housing where tenants can live indefinitely and provides rights of tenure. And then how do we define supportive housing? Is really affordable housing where tenants have access to support services, so regular case management. So methodology, how did Lisa find this data and generate these findings and recommendations? First, she did a deep data dive. So she looked at our point in time count, which is kind of a snapshot of where we count our sheltered and unsheltered homeless population one night in January and report that to HUD. She looked at our housing inventory count. So what is the available housing in our COC and how many of those subsidies, how many of those supportive housing beds are being used? She looked at our annual performance report, our system performance measures. So that's really looking at how well our COC is performing at exiting people to permanent destinations. So through that, we can see how quickly people are moving through the system, where people are being exited to, and if they're returning to homelessness. And then finally, like I mentioned, our homeless management information system. So that real-time tracking of who's experiencing homelessness in Tompkins County. There's also some other assessments that were included that were performed within the last 10 years that also kind of looked at homelessness and housing in Tompkins County. She also did some qualitative interviews with stakeholders and people with lived experience of homelessness, and then compared all that data to 9 COCs. So those immediately surrounding Tompkins County, as you can see in this map here, as well as some other COCs that have similar population sizes or geographic makeup. So now getting to the data. So these are the primary data observations that we wanted to highlight. So the first one is the length of stay, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's how long people are staying in our emergency shelter. And we have seen that has increased. So in funding year 2020, the average length of stay for all households was 91 days in our emergency shelter. So on average, that's about 3 months that people are spending in our emergency shelter before they are exited to any destination. Measure 2 is returns to homelessness. So after we exit someone to a permanent destination, how many people are returning to homelessness? And that's about 32% for us. So we are seeing a lot of returns to homelessness in Tompkins County when we're comparing that to those COCs in that previous map. And then the final measure that we just wanted to highlight is first-time homelessness and chronic homelessness. So we are seeing more chronic homelessness in our continuum of care. About half of our homeless population at this point, or 45.1%, are chronically homeless. And I just have a few graphs and representations to kind of bring home those points. So we're talking about length of stay, looking at why our length of stay in emergency shelter is increasing. It's because we are seeing this bottleneck effect across our programs. So if we're looking at 2021, we had 122 people that we knew were experiencing literal homelessness in Tompkins County, but we only had 22 beds available in our continuum of care to support those people. So what we're seeing is between low vacancy rates across our programs, across low cost housing in Tompkins County generally, are there's just no beds to move people into. Between those low vacancy rates is also the high cost of rents in the city of Ithaca. Even when people do have subsidies to be able to afford, other permanent beds or permanent destinations, sometimes those high rent costs are too high for them to be able to use the subsidy on that unit. So we are really seeing a lack of low-cost housing to be able to move our homeless population to once they enter our homeless response system. Yeah, that's pretty much demonstrated here. There's a little graph about returns to homelessness. So as you can see, these are all the COCs that Lisa compared our COC to, and you can see that ours are the highest at 32% in funding year 2020. And then finally, types of homelessness. So we are seeing a decrease in the first time enrolled proportionally compared to people who were previously enrolled in the shelter or other programming or that we know of a homeless history. And we are seeing that increase in our chronically homeless population to being about half of our homeless population. What is causing these trends? So I kind of touched on this already, but our low cost housing stock is critically low. We are simply having a hard time moving people out of our emergency shelter and out of our homeless response system because there's no beds for them to go to. Individuals experiencing homelessness are having trouble both accessing and maintaining housing and services. So that's when we're talking about chronic homelessness and returns to homelessness. We're just finding that even when people are exited to permanent destinations, there are some difficulties with maintaining that housing. And then finally, the projects that are funded through our COC are constrained in their capacity to adequately serve our homeless population in its entirety. So we have that low number of beds, but also just eligibility for those units just constrains our capacity to adequately serve everyone who's experiencing homelessness. So some other data observations that we wanted to mention as well. So first is Couchsurfers. So like I mentioned earlier, people who are couch surfing and people who are doubled up are not included in that HUD definition of literal homelessness, but they do represent a sizable population of Tompkins County that is at a high risk of homelessness. So they're not served by our COC, they're not counted by our COC, despite the likelihood that they are going to experience continued homelessness. I just wanted to note that our emergency shelter system at this moment does require that if someone has somewhere else to stay, if someone has somewhere else to be doubled up with someone, that they go to that situation before they enter emergency shelter. So those diversion efforts exist, but there's no targeted outreach for that population once they return to that doubled up situation to serve them before they need emergency shelter. So some other data observations, we are seeing some racial disparities in who is experiencing homelessness in our COC. So we see that Black and African American and Hispanic Latino households are disproportionately represented in our homeless population, and that Black and African American adults in particular are more likely to return to homelessness in households led by white adults. And so we're interested in kind of determining why we're seeing these racial disparities. We do see a lot of them more in our transitional housing than in some of our other destinations for people, but we are interested in kind of exploring some more of those. And then finally, considerations for youth. So a lot of interviewed youth indicated that they generally just have a lack of knowledge of the available resources and are more resistant to utilizing the emergency shelter. So they're more likely to be represented in that couch surfing population and underserved because there isn't as much targeted outreach to couch surfers to prevent them from becoming literally homeless. So those are just a few data observations that our governance committee wanted to bring up and decided was notable for this presentation. I'm going to pass it over to Liddy to talk about some of the recommendations that our governance committee also put together.
Thanks, Simone. So what are we going to do, right? We just got a pretty heavy bit of data and information. I'm just going to add that it was interesting to go through this really deep dive into our data and the process of this pretty large scale report because the whole time I was hoping that we were going to find something new, and we didn't, right? We found that the things that we felt like were happening, but now we can prove it with data. And so we also found, that homelessness is nuanced and complicated and requires a lot of strategies. And there's like literally no one solution that we could apply and wave a magic wand and solve homelessness in our community. I just wanted to start by saying that. So these are our recommendations. They are ranked in order of priority by our Continuum of Care Governance Committee, as Simone mentioned. So this is them briefly, but we'll just move on to the next slides and I'll dive into each of them a little bit. So let's see our next slide, please. Our number one recommendation to disrupt the high level of returns to homelessness and long lengths of stay and chronic homelessness in our system is to support the creation of additional permanent supportive housing in our community. Currently in our community, we have about 83 beds of permanent supportive housing units. We'll call them units because some of them are larger than one bedroom. And they work pretty well at both quickly using a housing first perspective to get somebody quickly stabilized into permanent housing, and then adding person-centered wraparound supports to those folks once they've already entered the housing unit. So it takes away folks who are able to enter into permanent supportive housing face a lot less barriers at entry to housing, and can easily transition from the shelter or even the street into permanent supportive housing because those locations are set up to serve people with higher needs. So the data shows us that people have much lower returns to homelessness who exited to a permanent supportive housing destination. And like it says, this held true for everybody, but it showed up the most for Black and African American households in our system. So this is an intervention that works well, and it seems to be working well for our Black and African American households, especially. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation is more of the rest of the kind of housing. So we need more housing of all types. We need housing with supports and regular, just sort of small, low cost units that are available to be rented by people who are at or below 30% of AMI in our community. We are choosing to be really careful about using the word affordable housing in this presentation because we are sort of eminently aware that while there's a known definition of what affordable housing is, it doesn't feel affordable to the population that we're talking about here. So even though there have been sort of a lot of affordable housing units developed in the last year, and there's some more in the pipeline, those units are still out of reach for people who are currently experiencing homelessness or using a number of subsidies or vouchers to pay for their housing. We are also using the word SROs in this slide, single room occupancies, but what we really mean are small units. So the single room occupancy model is sometimes associated with like a boarding house model. I think what we're really saying here are small units for single households. And that is illustrated in the data that you can see on the slide, just to show you what the household composition types were like for households in our system. So there were 53 families in our system in that year, adults with children in their household. They were more able to locate permanent housing than our 473 adult-only single households. Next slide. Our third recommendation is to create and fund an enhanced housing navigation style service. So one thing that we heard and are aware of and our data reflects is that people, for an array of reasons, struggle kind of at every point of their journey from homelessness to permanent housing, and feel unsupported by any particular agency or group in that journey. It feels fragmented to people. There's a lot of frustration about repetitive, having to fill the same thing out a lot of times. It's sort of hazy and unclear to navigate a housing system. I think probably a lot of us have experienced being in one of these kinds of meetings and somebody's trying to explain like Section 8 and public housing, and the systems are very complicated. They are complicated for professionals to navigate, and even harder for people experiencing homelessness. So this recommendation speaks to the need for intensive case management services for people who are invested and interested in accessing those services in order to attain their a permanent housing destination, as we call it in HUD. There's a lot of people who do a little part of this for folks, but there currently is no one person in our community who is tasked with housing navigation. And so we are interested in exploring the creation of a housing navigation position. Next slide, please. Oh, this is our quote. This is a lot. I'm not going to read the whole quote because I don't like reading whole quotes, but what really stood out to us, we have put in orange for you today. But this speaks to that decentralized feeling in our homeless response system. People struggle. They struggle to navigate the system. So, and it is hard to do alone. And it's hard to, there's communication barriers sort of built into the silos that exist within our system right now. So providers even struggle to communicate with one another about housing navigation and actually end up spinning their wheels a lot. So because one person is getting helped by a lot of little places, somebody will end up filling out the same application like 5 times and not another one. So enhancing communication and cohesiveness would help. Next slide. This is our 4th recommendation. We recommend, and this is a little like out of the box for COC, who traditionally has been like, we serve people experiencing literal homelessness. But one thing that this research has brought to the forefront is that we do have a lack of prevention services in our continuum. And so a common pathway to homelessness involve like there are places at which prevention could have stepped in and made it so that person never came into our homeless response system at all, but we don't know how to find the people. There are people who need prevention services, and there are some actual prevention services, but there's no way to, we aren't doing outreach with our prevention, I guess is the best way to say that. So we recommend heightening our outreach specifically to youth who are experiencing homelessness, people of color, and people who are in that couch surfer doubled up position. We believe in investing that energy could prevent people from experiencing homelessness for the first time or returning to homelessness after having exited homelessness. We this year we're working on developing a way to attempt to count our couch surfing population, but currently there's no existing data on this population, and so we have some estimates there in our data slide, and you can see where they came from. There's a lot of people doubled up and living on couches, and they're not very far from the front door to the emergency shelter, and we would like to keep them from having to do that if they don't have to. Next slide, please. Our 5th recommendation from the report is to expand the capacity of our emergency shelter. We have a pretty small on-site shelter. There's 20 beds on-site in our emergency shelter here. Since COVID, I don't believe that they've ever been at full capacity for those beds, but they could be. And then we use hotels and motels for our overflow beds for people when the shelter is full. And there's usually about 60 of those hotel motel beds in use at any given time in our system. Next slide, please. So the expansion of capacity of the size of our emergency shelter would mitigate some of the things that we have heard and found, which is has to do with well, the emergency shelter, if it was in its current location, is much more accessible to services and appointments and places that people are required to be as part of their maintaining their approval for the shelter. It helps people be a little more connected to social services, loaves and fishes, all of the places that people experience. It's a lot of work to be homeless, and it all happens in downtown Ithaca currently. It would also increase the level of contact between shelter staff and shelter stayers in a way that we believe would support people experiencing homelessness in their ability to transition out of the emergency shelter, because they'd be building those relationships of trust with professionals. Currently, people who are in the hotel motel part of the emergency shelter do have some contact with shelter staff, but they are primarily interacting with motel staff, which is they have different training requirements and levels of compassion than I would say our shelter staff probably do. Next slide. Thank you. That's our last slide. That's a lot of information. I'm pretty sure that everyone has the full report at their disposal as well. It's a big read, but it is worth the read. I think there's a lot to digest. There's different people have definitely landed on different parts of the report. There are things that we were not able to include in this presentation that are certainly important too. So I hope that you find the time to read the real report, and we're happy to answer any questions for you now if you want.
Thank you, Simone and Liddy. Very sobering and insightful report, and you have demonstrated through this, these slides and the full report, the need in our community. So open it up for questions from committee members. Questions or comments? I wonder if you can comment on what is in the pipeline now in terms of housing, especially supportive housing units. There are some
Sure.
to be included in Asteri, for example.
Yeah. So there are, I believe, 18, it could be 20, I can't remember, one of those numbers of units in the Founders Way project that's funded through it's Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative. You'll hear people call it ESHI. Those units come with a subsidy, a rent subsidy, and a pretty significant amount of money for case management. Those are being managed by a partnership between Salvation Army and the Learning Web, and focus on youth, but actually have a number of different categories that are eligible. And then Green Street Asteri project has 40 units of also ESHI funded housing that has a chronic homeless priority. Those are the big ones. And then St. John's has a very small family site project that was just funded through the Continuum of Care. I think that's kind of it in the near future. There may be others. Founders Way is opening as affordable housing, but there are no 30% units in that project. So it's in that affordable but unaffordable for this when we're talking about the people experiencing homelessness category.
I wonder if you could also comment on housing choice vouchers, and if there has been any, I hate to even ask this question, but is there any expansion of units, landlords taking housing choice vouchers and vouchers themselves, any increase in our community?
This is something that HSC is working on and has we have a small program devoted to increasing the number of people with the number of units available to people with vouchers. The short answer is no. People don't want vouchers. They want money and they want more of it than the voucher can pay for. There are additional vouchers coming into our community, right? So there are more people who are able to get either a housing choice voucher. There's a few, there's an emergency housing voucher program. There's a few additional vouchers floating around right now, but I have not seen any sort of loosening in the available units for voucher holders. I will say, without getting too off the script, that there's a small wave. I call it like a small eviction wave coming, bigger than small, medium eviction wave coming on the docket already. We know it's there. Starts tomorrow. Some of those persons will lose their housing, and a voucher holder will access it. That's not a perfect solution. It's literal musical chairs. But the rental market COVID has skewed it in a number of ways. And one of the ways is that there wasn't a natural sort of people leaving a unit and other people coming into the unit. People were staying in their units a little bit longer during COVID. I don't know if that was maybe more or weirder information than you wanted, but.
No, it's helpful. Thank you. Any other comments, questions? Cynthia?
Hi, Lydia and Simone. Thank you so much for the presentation. One of the things that I'm hoping that you can touch on, and there's two questions. Of the numbers of homeless that you're monitoring, what is the percentage of individuals that are sanctioned? Basically, they have barriers to getting housing vouchers, access to emergency shelter, either for whatever reason. So what is that percentage? Because I do see, and I absolutely 100% support all of these recommendations, but I am also very mindful that you might go forward with these recommendations, but there's a bulk of individuals that even if this was done, they still would not have access to it because of their sanction status. So what is that percentage? And how do we address that? Sorry.
So when, that's a good question. There is I think what you mean by sanction is people who are federally barred from accessing vouchers. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean sanctioned by DSS for emergency shelter? Because they're two separate answers.
Well, my understanding is that you need to meet certain qualifications in order to get access. And maybe I'm using the wrong word.
No,
I just wanted better terminology.
I just wanted to make sure I understand what you're saying now. So for housing, for permanent housing, for anything that the COC is referring to, your ability to attain DSS services or not is irrelevant. A sanction does not prevent you from being housed at a permanent supportive housing site at all.
Okay.
So it doesn't DSS sanctions, which are a local or county or state, however you want to think about it, aren't connected to permanent supportive housing. Okay. A person with a sanction can go into permanent supportive housing. There is a population of people who are unable to enter into permanent supportive housing or federally funded voucher programs. And there's two groups that are like 100% not allowed. One are people who have a conviction for manufacturing methamphetamines in housing, which is a pretty specific conviction, but that's the rule. And then the second category are people who are required to be lifetime registrants of the sex offender registry. Other than that, all persons are theoretically eligible for any of the permanent supportive housing options. There are individual reasons, but those are the only two one-off, those are the only two hard no's to get into those projects. We don't track DSS sanctions formally because they're fluid and not directly linked to continuum of care projects. It's hard to explain. We don't have a number for the number of people who are sanctioned, but DSS probably does, I would say, know how many people are sanctioned of this population, because they share our HMIS data, but have their own database for local data.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And this is complicated, right? Each level has its own set of requirements, and you know, of
It
course, you know, it becomes really complex.
It does become complex. That's why permanent supportive housing is our #1 recommendation, because it is the lowest threshold for entry. It's the lowest barrier way to house people with barriers to housing.
Mhm. Thank you.
I think your question is also pointing out the need for a housing navigator, someone who can assist people with all the different pockets of service and what can be very easily felt by anyone as a lot of red tape.
Yeah, I mean, I could wear you out right now with red tape rules. if we could, yeah.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up, Cynthia?
I guess one of the things I'm also observing, and I wondered if you could touch on, is, you know, there's also individuals who struggle working within a society where there are expectations and normative behaviors that we expect of others. And perhaps, again, as you mentioned, permanent supportive housing would be the most appropriate way to assist individuals and transition them into other permanent housing options. But having that wraparound support and assistance is really key to addressing the needs of our growing population.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
More of a
Phoebe, I
follow-up.
see your hand. Phoebe, you're on mute right now.
I just did it.
You
Hi,
got it.
everybody. Thank you for that that informational, very good. That was just really so. I mean, y'all really did your work. You really did your work. You really did your work, and it brought up a lot of things for me. Right? It brought up that for one. When you talk about it was clear about who this homelessness affects as most everything in our community, Black and brown and Latino, and though are hit the hardest with a lot of these things. And I think what kept coming to me is the point of that, because housing in Ithaca is so high, it still does not. So people get the housing, but they still are behind, right? So they will wind up homeless again, right? Because of, other things. So what I'm saying is, we talked about having a wraparound, but a wraparound of more like other services working together. So my ask is, are you working? So do the workforce work with y'all also to figure out, like, how do we get people to a place that they can afford? Even though people get Section 8 and stuff like that, the majority of the people who have that assistance still have to pay a large amount of their rent, right? I know, been there, done that, right? And so what was coming up for me too is that, how do we interact all these different pieces that go together, right? Because a lot of it is about systemic racism, is why many of those people are in the places that they're in. And I don't know, so that's a conversation that doesn't come up. People kind of go over that and dodge that type of stuff, but many people are in the situation because of the way our systems have been set up. So how do we, because I'm really someone who's I don't want people to just survive. I want to see people thrive, right? So how do we get people in these positions to have permanent housing, And then I do have a lot of people. So I work at the Alliance of Families for Justice. So I have a lot of people who come through there who talk about how long and how hard it is to try to get housing, right? And we have this big thing. So I'm so glad y'all said that piece about not using affordable housing, right? So I really want to thank y'all for a valuable presentation. And it's going to make me really think tonight and really talk more about how do we, and another thing people don't bring up is gentrification, right? Do not bring up gentrification in these conversations. And that has pushed while we're at where we're at. So anyway, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank y'all.
Well, thank you for
Thanks, Phoebe.
your comments and feedback, Phoebe. I just wanted to comment on a question or something you brought up about, how we collaborated with workforce, and we thought about, that idea of wraparound services. And I will just say at HSC, we have another, again, small program. It's called the Housing Stability Supplement Program. And through that, we, people receive a basic income, but they also work with our 211 housing specialist, which is someone who has a special focus on housing, but also knows about all of the resources that are available through our 211 information and referral line, and can kind of help to provide some of those wraparound like resources and referrals to help support people in all those different elements and really build that relationship. And so that they can have one person they go to and say like, hey, my car broke down, I need some help with that. Where do I go? So we're really seeing some success like with that program and with that model. And that's my coworker here, Brett Irish, who's doing a really great job just connecting people with those resources and focusing on that sustainability of, okay, we're working on housing stability right now, but how can we also sustain future housing stability even after the program is over? So that has been a model we've seen be very successful, and I'm interested to see what we can build on that when we're thinking about enhanced housing navigation and the potential for that. So thank you for your comments. It's nice to meet you.
Any other comments or questions? I think we're all agreed that this has been a very valuable presentation. Thank you both, Simone and Liddy. Thank you very much.
Thank
Keep
you.
doing
Thanks
that
for having
good
us.
work you're doing. Okay. Actually, this is a very nice segue because we will now be turning to the, and this will be a voting item, the HUD, the 2022 action plan. And there was a revised resolution sent out late this afternoon to committee members, but we can walk you through. I say we. I will turn to my very talented colleague, Anissa Mendizabal, who does just great work in getting information out to individuals and to organizations about the programs that are available through the HUD entitlement program, and then meeting with organizations and working with the IURA on making recommendations. So let me read the revised resolution in your packet, and then I will turn it over to Anissa for questions. And in your packet, you also have the recommendations of awards that have been discussed and determined by the IURA. So the resolution.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
Sure.
I'm not sure that the most recent revised made it to the packets. I could be wrong, but I have it up on screen.
I think we did get it.
Okay.
Yeah, at it was around 5 o'clock.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry.
It was after you and I spoke.
Okay. All right. Good work.
So
Debbie
the
and everyone.
teamwork, yes. So the revised resolution reads, whereas the City of Ithaca City is eligible to receive an annual formula allocation of funds to address community development needs through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development Entitlement Program from the CDBG program and the Home Program funding sources. And whereas the city has contracted with the IURA to administer, implement, and monitor the city's HUD entitlement program in compliance with all applicable regulations. And whereas on an annual basis, an action plan must be submitted to HUD to access HUD entitlement program funding allocated to the city. And whereas the 2022 action plan identifies a specific list of budgeted community development activities to be funded from the 2022 HUD entitlement program allocation and associated funds administered by the IURA. Whereas the IURA utilized an open and competitive project selection process for development of the 2022 action plan in accordance with the City of Ithaca Citizen Participation Plan. Whereas as of May 12th, 2022, the U.S. Department of HUD had not officially notified entitlement communities of 2022 CDBG or home allocations. And whereas funding available to be allocated through the 2022 action plan funding process is anticipated to include the following: $668,000 CDBG 2022 allocation, $120,000 CDBG 2022 projected program income, $601.96 CDBG recaptured unallocated funds, $330,000 home 2022 allocation, $13,000, $315.40 in home recaptured unallocated funds, for a total of $1,132,117.36. Whereas the IURA recommended action plan includes contingencies to accommodate the possibility that actual HUD allocations may differ from the anticipated allocations. Specifically, should the city's 2022 home allocation be greater than anticipated, funding for the following recommended activities will be increased: INHS Homeowner Rehab Project, INHS Sears Street Development Project. Should the city's 2022 home allocation be less than anticipated, funding for the following recommended activities will be decreased according to two priorities in the following order: Homeowner Rehab Project, INHS, deduct up to $24,375, and any remaining home allocation decrease would be deducted from. Sears Street Development Project, INHS. Should the city's 2022 CDBG allocation be greater than anticipated, funding for the following recommended activities will be increased: bus stops and shelters, TCAT, GIAC Computer Lab, Economic Development Loan Fund. These would be increased if there is greater than anticipated funding. Should the city's 2022 CDBG allocation be less than anticipated, funding for the following recommended activities will be decreased according to three priorities in the following order: Catholic Charities Building, INHS, deduct 85% of the project funding decrease from this project. Latino No Mas Lagrimas, deduct up to $1,400 of the project funding decrease from this project. GIAC Computer Lab, $1,896 per computer station, deduct any further project funding decrease from this project. Whereas the IURA used an open and competitive project selection process for development of the 2022 action plan in accordance with the City of Ithaca's Citizen Participation Plan, and whereas a public hearing on the draft action plan was held earlier this evening, May 18, 2022, now therefore be it resolved, the Common Council hereby adopts City's 2022 HUD Entitlement Annual Action Plan, including the attached summary table titled IURA Recommended Draft 2022 Action Plan, City of Ithaca, New York, dated March 24, 2022, and revised to reflect the actual CDBG and home funding awards for allocations of the city's 2022 HUD Entitlement Program Award, along with associated funds listed above. And be it further resolved that the IURA shall be amended to include activities funded in and adopted 2022 action plan. And I so move. Rob seconds, and we'll open this up for discussion. Before we open it for questions, it may be helpful, Anissa, if you don't mind me turning to you for clarification, because I understand there were updates from HUD that came just yesterday. So thank you for you and Nels having very speedily worked on these changes that we'll hear about. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for reading that very lengthy resolution, a lot of complexity, a lot of numbers. So yes, I'm here to talk about the plan that has been created and also provide this update that Laura just spoke about. Just yesterday, HUD notified us of our official and actual awards for the upcoming 2022 program year. So just to clarify, up until this very moment, we've been working with estimates. So the numbers here that you see on the screen as part of the resolution, the $668,000 in CDBG 2022 allocation, the $330,000 in home 22 allocation, those were anticipated. We've had to work with these estimates throughout the planning process because due to the delay in the federal budget process, HUD did not have its official awards to be, could not calculate those awards until the federal budget was adopted. And so then following its statute, it had until May 14th to notify us, which I think it actually may have done through the Postal Service, but we just found out yesterday what our actual awards are. And there's been a reduction in both streams. So the actual award for CDBG, instead of the $668,000 that you see on the screen, is going to be $633,333. So 633,333. And instead of the $330,000 that you see on the screen for home, we will receive $316,825. So that represents, a difference of from our anticipated. Sorry, I should have added those two things together, but so I'll say about $56,000 less, a little more than that, than we were expecting overall, if my math is correct on the fly there. So that means that we will implement the contingencies that were put in place in case our award was decreased. So the homeowner rehab project will be deducting funds from that. The total amount that will be deducted is in the $11,000 range, because please remember that there's also money that's going to be directed to our admin lines. And then, but the Sears Street development will not be affected. Then we'll move down to further in the resolution where the CDBG allocation, where that is less. The Catholic Charities building will be affected primarily, and that will receive $23,573 less than anticipated, or less than was recommended for them. then No Mas Lagrimas will receive $1,400 less, and the GIAC Computer Lab will receive $2,760 less. So part of how the CDBG area was structured, to give you a little background on why the Catholic Charities portion is so much larger as a scaling than number 2 and number 3, No Mas Lagrimas and the GIAC Computer Lab, is that only 15% of any HUD award any CDBG award that we receive can be used for public services. Both No Mas Lagrimas and the Computer Lab are in the public services category. So Catholic Charities building, which is CDBG funded, is in the category that's considered a public facility. And so 85% of the CDBG funds go to the 3 categories that are not public services. So that's why the reduction, when you look at these 3 programs, why the reduction in the Catholic Charities building was so much greater than either of the public services. I can explain that in more detail if you want, but just wanted to give you a little overview of that. So that is the resolution. I can answer detailed questions on that. But before we go there, I thought you might like a little bit of a snapshot of what the applications were this year. You did see the black and white matrix in your packet was there to show you, a little bit more about what's been going on in the process. We received 21 on-time applications this year. Those are the ones that were outlined on the black and white matrix in your packet. That's 2 less on-time applications than we received in the previous 2 years. Previous 2021 and 2020, we received 23 applications each year. As is not uncommon, the total amount of requests, the dollar amount of requests, far exceeded the anticipated amount of funds, and even the actual amount of funds that we received by about $1 million. That's not unusual, though in some years that ratio is much greater. We have a dollar amount of requests that is much, much greater than just the $1 million differential that I mentioned. It's good to remember that no matter what amount of home and CDBG funding the city has to work with, these funds leverage a lot of other funding in the community. And you can see that on the spreadsheet. The colorful matrix down at the bottom gives you some of those numbers. This is something that is not often talked about, but something that's very important about the HUD entitlement funding that we receive, because I would say it brings a lot of other donors in some ways to the table. When we are soliciting applications for the process, we do ask on our application how much secured matching funds and unsecured matching funds that have been applied for each project brings with it. So we have an idea of how many other funds are coming to the table to be able to make these projects an actuality. Normally, these HUD funds do not fully fund any one project that's out there. And HUD does encourage and does like to see funds being leveraged from other sources with the HUD dollars. The applications all go through a very careful and comprehensive review process by the IRA, which included another public hearing where there were public presentations by all the applicants, and the reviewers had a chance to ask questions. And there are actually several review meetings by the board and committees prior to making the recommendations. I see a hand. Would you like to ask a question right now?
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I was just hoping to I missed 2 of the numbers of the actual numbers you said and not the percentages for how much less was GIAC receiving?
Oh, okay, yes. Let me go there. I was going to talk about that afterwards, but I have that here. So GIAC will receive $2,760 less than was recommended. And
Perfect. And then
No Muss Lagermus, the one above that, $1,400 less.
perfect. And then Catholic Charities was 23,000 and
Five-
right? The
23,573
Less.
less. Yes,
less. Okay, perfect. Thank you. I missed that
Sure.
number. It was going
Yeah.
by.
understand. So, just wanted to give you a little additional information that we don't always talk about in terms of, what else happens in the action planning process. We had 5 new applicants this year. 2 of those 5 new applicants were funded. It's very exciting to see new applicants, new to us applicants, not that they're necessarily new organizations. And we will continue to do outreach to all of the community to try to always have more new applicants. We actually have some plans to do some outreach this summer to that end. So I think I can stop there, since I'm sure you have a lot of questions, or some questions anyway, that I hope that I can answer.
Yeah, thank you. And as I said, I do appreciate the revisions. I know that this is complex every year. There is the possibility that funds may increase, may decrease. It's unfortunate this year that we saw the decrease in both CDBG and home funds, but those figures that we see on the resolution that we'll vote on after discussion, those figures will be updated and reflected in the resolution that will be sent to Common Council. Okay, so other comments or questions for Anissa? Phoebe?
So forgive me if I'm not so I'm a little I don't know much about this process here.
Sure.
You know, this is pretty new to me. But after listening to Liddy and her coworker, and then listening to HUD, I'm just I'm trying to understand. HUD is Housing Urban Development, right?
HUD is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The city receives funds from HUD.
From
Yeah.
HUD, yeah. So, and then, so it's kind of behooving to me that we still have the issues that we have when we receive this kind of money, right? And again, we get this money for so-called affordable housing, and those same people get funded pretty much every year, but we just hear Lydia and them talk about that is not helping the population, right? You know, so I'm a little baffled, and I'll do a little more study, and maybe I'll find some time to sit down and talk with you, Anissa, and get a little clearer about how this whole thing works, because I think that's what I'm not understanding, right?
Yeah, Phoebe, I'll jump in. I'll just jump in and say that the IURA and Anissa in particular does a fair amount of outreach to alert organizations in the community about the HUD entitlement program. And what you do see on the chart is, and it's very small print, but you do see the name of the project, the sponsor of the project, the funding request. So for example, if you look down under public services, the first item, the first project listed is 211 information and referral. And they requested from the IURA $25,000. There is a recommendation, and all of this will be approved, will come before Common Council. It comes before PEDC first. and the IURA makes recommendations based on what the organization is requesting. But
Okay.
I'm
All
sure
right.
I'm sure Anissa can give you far better explanation, a more complete explanation.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate your question very much, PB, and I would absolutely be happy to sit down with you and any members of council, any member of the community who's listening tonight to talk about this more, because there's a lot of complexity to this and it's confusing too. And HUD does not necessarily use like super easy to understand language, at least for me. What I'll say is, so one thing to help put it in perspective, because I do also believe that the HUD funds that we receive are incredibly important here in Ithaca, but we receive less than $1 million a year at this point. And when we think of the multiple kinds of ways that we could use those funds, and we think about all the different needs out there, including the needs that Lydia and Simone outlined, which are extremely important, I think, to all of us here. $1 million does not do as much as we would like it to be able to do to solve all the problems that are out there. So even when we talk about, especially when we talk about establishing housing, constructing housing, incredibly costly projects, and our HUD funds end up being a little tiny part of that. But it's still important. But I hear you, and I think that you are voicing what I've heard from many community members is, how can these big problems still exist when we get funds like this from HUD? And one answer to that is, like, we do not receive anywhere near as much money as we would need to really solve those problems. But the funding that we get is important. And I'd be happy to talk more another time, because I know that other people have questions.
Yeah, I'll turn to Rob in a moment. I just want to reiterate something that Elsa Anissa said, and that is that these funds also help these organizations leverage other funds. So that too is really valuable to keep in mind. Let me turn to Rob. I
It's
see you have
really
your hand up.
valuable. Someone who's been homeless and know what it feels like. It sounds a little different to me than it might sound to you. But thank you.
Understood.
Rob?
Definitely understand.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, thank you. Really not a question, but just a comment that picks up on a lot of this conversation, which is, you know, as the new liaison from Common Council to the IURA, replacing Laura, who got to slide into the mayor's seat. I want to just thank Anissa and really all the members of IURA, because it is a very heavy lift to go through and try to make connections between, you know, the limited resources and the needs of the community, and to do that review. And so the IURA members do a lot of work in the first quarter of really it starts at the end of last year through the first quarter of this year. So yeah, Phoebe, I hope you do take them up on the opportunity to learn more, because I think it's important for us on council to understand how this comes about. And I think when we can't meet the needs of some of these organizations through this kind of funding, it's important for us to know what their needs are, and we might be able to find other sources of funding for them. So that's important. So thank you all for that work.
Thanks, Rob. Other comments or questions? Okay, we're ready to vote. All those in favor of the revised resolution, please raise your hand. Great, thank you. That is unanimous. And thank you, Anissa, for all your work on this. It is it's a complex and important part of the work you do for the IURA. And as mentioned, the resolution will be updated with those numbers as it comes to council for our June 1 review. Okay.
Thank you to all of you for your questions, and I look forward to talking with you more. Have a good night.
Thanks, Anissa.
Thank you, Lisa.
Okay. We'll now turn to the East Hill Fire Station. I see that Chief Parsons has joined us and Nels is here as well. There's a very helpful cover memo in our packet that lays out what is being asked tonight. I'll just refer to a couple of lines in Lisa's memo. First, the committee will hold a public hearing to gather input on the proposal. That public hearing was held earlier this evening. There were no members of the public commenting at the public hearing. And second, the committee will consider a resolution authorizing the acting mayor, subject to review by the city attorney, to transfer the 309 College Avenue site to IURA via a city IURA option agreement. And 2, assign the option agreement to IURA. And 3, execute any other such documents as may be necessary to enable the IURA to undertake an urban renewal procedure that authorizes a negotiated acquisition and sales agreement. So I will, well, let me read the resolution, and then we can begin with discussion and comments from Nels and the chief, both of whom will be far, far better at explaining yet another important but complex project. So the resolution in the packet, East Hill Fire Station relocation, authorized transfer of property and assignment of option to IURA. Whereas the City of Ithaca Common Council desires to relocate the East Hill Fire Station, also known as Fire Station Number 2, currently located at 309 College Avenue, and whereas in connection with the relocation and to raise funds for the construction of the new station, the city intends to sell the existing 309 College Ave parcel, which will be decommissioned as a fire station following the relocation. And whereas the city issued requests for expressions of interest regarding the 309 College Ave site on July 12, 2018 and February 5, 2021. And whereas the city received and reviewed responses submitted to the RFEIs, and whereas 311 CA Associates LLC, the developer, expressed interest through the RFEI process in acquiring the existing 309 College Ave site in exchange for cash consideration and an alternative site for the East Hill Fire Station. And whereas the city entered into an option agreement with the developer dated February 22, 2022, that permits but does not require the city to sell 309 College Ave to the developer in exchange for 2 parcels located at 403 Elmwood Avenue and 408 Dryden Road, in addition to cash consideration of $5.1 million to be paid to the city on the terms contained within the option agreement. And whereas Section 507 of General Municipal Law authorizes disposition of real property without auction or sealed bid via an urban renewal process. And whereas the Common Council requests the IURA review the terms of the proposed option agreement and structure a proposed disposition agreement to relocate the East Hill Fire Station. Now therefore be it resolved that the acting mayor, subject to review by the city attorney, is hereby authorized to 1, transfer the 309 College Ave site to the IURA via a city IURA option agreement. 2, assign the option agreement to the IURA. And 3, execute any other such documents as may be necessary to enable the IURA to undertake an urban renewal procedure that authorizes a negotiated acquisition and sales agreement. And be it further resolved that the option with the developer shall not be exercised by IURA on behalf of the city, nor shall the IURA authorize the transfer of 309 College Ave parcel without further approval of the Common Council. And be it further resolved that the IRA is authorized and requested to act on behalf of the city with respect to negotiating and structuring the acquisition and sale process contemplated above, subject to final approval of the Common Council. And be it further resolved that IURA shall be reimbursed for all reasonable costs incurred to structure the proposed acquisition and sale agreement. So let me now turn it over to Nels and Chief Parsons. I do.
Sorry, you need a second on the motion.
I'm sorry?
You need a second on the motion?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Is there a second? Thank you. I saw Rob's hand. I do understand there were some comments submitted. And Lisa, there were a few comments submitted, and I don't know if there are any that you want to read, but what I recall, the comments had concerns with traffic, with the road conditions, suitability of the site. It is the case, and Chief Parsons can comment on this in greater detail, that currently from the College Ave site, fire trucks have to navigate a 90-degree turn onto College Avenue, if I'm not mistaken. And there were also questions about number of calls. And Lisa, is there any additional comments in what was received?
That really covers it. Particularly, I want to say that the suitability of Dryden Road as a place for it, as a corridor for fire trucks, it would be really helpful if Chief Parsons could talk to me.
Yeah, and I'll just add one final comment, and then I'll turn it over. Cynthia has a question. That what we're reviewing and what has been worked on up to this point is almost the culmination of about 8 years of searching for another site for the East Hill Fire Station. So this has been a lengthy process, and I think this proposal is one that benefits the city considerably. So Cynthia, did you have a question before we turn it over to Nels and the chief?
Yes, thank you. I have received also additional comments. The first comment is perhaps a question. Were all the applicants who responded to the RFP given an opportunity to negotiate with the city to put together a proposal for consideration? The second comment I had received, which I think actually makes a lot of sense, is what assurance is built into the contract to make sure that the property that we are disposing of will remain on the tax rolls and not become a tax abated or tax-free property as a result of this transfer.
Nels, do you want to comment on the first question that has to do with the RFEI?
Sure. The RFEI did receive responses, and those responses were proposals that were conceptual in nature in most cases. And both of the applicants that had detailed responses, proposals, were given the opportunity to flesh out their proposals to the committee. One thing I want to note is that the agency members have had some preliminary discussion on this, and one of the things they want to do is review the RFEI responses and make sure the city is getting the best deal it can in the best interest of the city. So there'll be an opportunity now that the confidential property negotiation phase of this project has completed for an opportunity for the IRA and a public forum to take a look at those competing proposals and evaluate whether the one chosen going forward at this point with the option agreement is in fact in the best interest of the city.
Thank you.
And your second question, is there assurance that the 309 College Ave will continue to generate tax revenue for the city?
Not
Or what
aware.
assurances are going to be built in? Part of the evaluation, obviously, in terms of the attractiveness of one proposal over the other is projected property tax revenue of the parcel into the future. And so is there a structure built into the agreement to ensure that that tax revenue will be received, in the sense that that parcel will not become either part of the university or otherwise a tax abated property?
I don't believe the option agreement that was executed incorporates special terms regarding the tax status going in the future, but that's an issue that the Ithaca Urban Renewal Agency can explore and develop some recommendations. They have done that in the past on another property where they have required the purchaser of a property to enter into a pilot agreement that in the event that they get a tax exemption, they would have to pay the city an equal amount of funds that would have been owed in taxes to the city. So there can be some mechanisms that can address that issue. That's not part currently of the option that was negotiated between the prospective purchaser and the city, though.
Thank you. I think if we are basing this decision based in part on expected tax revenue, that should be incorporated and secured in some way.
Thank you.
And Laura, might I just speak very briefly to that as well?
Please, yes, go ahead, Ari.
Thank you. Sorry, I've just been listening here in the background, but I just wanted to add that in terms of comparing the and negotiating with the RFP responses, that the other that this response has no zoning guarantees that come with it in terms of what will be done with the College Ave site, and as you know, also did have specific parcels of new land upon which the city could build the station. And I think those are two very important elements that were not equally present in the other proposals. So I just wanted to note that.
The chief might be better able to answer some of the other questions that were, or issues that were raised earlier.
Sure. The question about the suitability of Dryden Road, we already use Dryden Road for emergency responses, particularly up East Hill and towards the town area. The width of the roadway is roughly 18 feet when you exclude the parking, which is the same width as College Ave is when you exclude the parking or make adjustments to allow the parking to remain. So the width of College Ave and the width of Dryden Road are virtually identical. So the access of being narrow on Dryden Road may seem like it's narrower, but in the reality of measurements, it's not. So I verified that today. There was a comment relative to pulling in and out of Dryden Road. The access to the fire station actually is from Elmwood Ave. The fire truck will be driving on Elmwood Ave and entering in the fire station from that side, not actually blocking traffic on Dryden Road. The East Hill Fire Station responds to I did a number from 2017, 2021, about 1,800 calls a year, which averages about 5.5 calls a day, and that's a 24-hour period. Maximum number of calls are just under 14. We have a few spikes through there, and fewest number of calls is 1 or 0 through that time period. The responses primarily go, and I have a drawing I can show if people. Let me get switched here to. If I can share the screen. Let me see if I can do that here. Okay.
Sorry.
There we go. Sorry. So this is the area we're talking about. So this fire station covers a large area, not just the Cornell campus, but it covers out into the town. It covers into the northern part of the city, Cornell Heights, and down into Fall Creek. it's pretty centrally located. If anything, we could, if we were going to be perfectly centered, it would move north a block, but it's pretty close to where it should be in the service area. And that's the most important thing about locating the fire station is where is it operationally most effective. There, I believe in one of the comments it was suggested was it looked at about placing it out on East Hill Plaza. The problem is when we start looking at routes coming out of East Hill Plaza, it runs a lot of those routes down through the Bell Sherman neighborhood. So we were trying to, so that was not necessarily a very good response area for us to come in and serve not only College Town, but it also made a very long run to go downtown and get into the northern part of the city. Without the East Hill Fire Station, those parts of the city, when the downtown engine's busy, would have to be covered from the fire station out beyond Ithaca College or out up by the hospital, which is very lengthy in time to respond down into those areas. So operationally, we're distributed appropriately, and this new station and its location would not have any negative impact as far as its operational effectiveness. I think I'll stop sharing. Did I cover the questions? I believe, Lisa, did I get the three? I think there was a question
Yes,
about
number of calls, suitability of the site, condition, road conditions. Those were the questions that I saw.
There was also a question, I believe, Ellen McAllister asked about as far as demolition or reclaiming the building. We'll certainly look at trying to deconstruct the building if it's what we can regarding the schedule and the feasibility and the financial feasibility of it. I spoke with the developers on College Ave because they did do some deconstruction on some of those buildings. We would look at probably working on some type of arrangement similar to what they did with the deconstruction. Actually, deconstruction is more expensive than demolition, just to pay a contractor to do deconstruction. So working out those two costs and making sure we get the best out of the process is certainly what we'll try to do.
Thank you. I'm not sure whose hand went up first, so I'll call on Rob. Rob, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And thank you, Chief, for hitting on those points. I think one other thing that it may have been Ellen McAllister's comment as well was asking about the design of the building and how it would fit into the character of the neighborhood, and maybe just for the public's understanding of this. And I don't know who to turn to this. Maybe it's Lisa or the Chief or others. Can you at least give them a sense of where there may be opportunities for people to provide input around that process as we move forward?
Yeah, I can speak to that. In the packet, I provided a revised schedule that lists all the public hearings in addition to other meetings. Highlights the public hearings. So there will be opportunities to comment at all of those, in addition to public comment at any public meeting. The project will go through a full site plan review process, as would any development project. It is subject to the College Town design guidelines. And so the planning board, as it always does, will be looking at the quality of materials, the compatibility of the design with the neighborhood, and the attractiveness of the landscaping and all of the things that would make it a better project rather than just a new project.
Thanks, Lisa. Did you have any follow-up, Rob?
No, that's it. Thank you. And thanks, Lisa. Yep.
Sure. Patrick?
Yeah, it's less of a question, more of just, I know you guys, when you first proposed this to us a month or so ago, it looked fantastic. I think it still looks fantastic. I'm really happy with the development in College Town. I know Rob and I have chatted about the shift of the station from Ward 4 to 3, but at least in terms of our little, very dense part of College Town, I think this is something that's going to make it more walkable. I'm sure it's going to help you guys from everything I've seen a lot as well. So just my sincere thanks to Nels and Chief Parsons and everybody who's worked on this.
Thanks, Patrick. Any other comments or questions? Okay, we ready to vote? And this is voting to send this on to council. All those in favor? Okay, that's unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chief Parsons, for joining us and answering many of the questions too. And Nels as well.
You're welcome.
Okay, we'll now turn to the policy, the proposed policy regarding encampments on city property. Here too, there is a resolution that I will read. Proposed policy regarding encampments on city property. Whereas former Mayor Myrick requested the IURA staff to develop a draft policy regarding encampments on city property for consideration by Common Council. And whereas an initial draft was developed and presented for input from the Ithaca Tompkins County Continuum of Care, community outreach workers, and the Tides Working Group. And whereas several modifications have been incorporated into the final proposed policy, and whereas Common Council procedures allow for reports to be accepted, endorsed, or adopted, now therefore be it resolved that the Common Council for the City of Ithaca hereby accepts the proposed policy regarding encampments on city property dated May 2022. And I so move. And is there a second? Thank you, Patrick. Discussion. And I can also turn it over to Nels, who, pardon me, has really done the major work on this draft policy statement. So Nels, I don't know if you want to walk through some of the key factors here, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments.
Sure. It was great that we had Liddy and Simone come earlier because they laid the groundwork for the issues that we have in the community in terms of our housing prices and the level of homelessness that occurs here. And certainly this issue is very directly related to those issues. But essentially the city has, as a landowner, has a major challenge here. We know that there are people camping on city property. It's not authorized nor regulated. And the city's laws on this are a little bit vague. I mean, but clearly zoning does not permit camping anywhere in the city, certainly not without going through a site plan review process and the zoning review process. And our city code clearly prohibits camping in natural areas. So the prior mayor asked me to take a look at this question and provide some ideas to think through and maybe even a potential policy to adopt at some point. But the challenges really are faced when there's a complaint received about an encampment. The city is faced with a challenge of what is the right response, and responding by clearance of a property can lead to negative outcomes for that person in terms of their options for alternatives. They're oftentimes in a desperate situation, but there also are neighbors who are adversely impacted by encampments as well. So there's this balance issue that is hard to find the right balance for, particularly when the homeless response system is at capacity, as you heard earlier. So there are oftentimes not an opportunity to direct somebody to another housing option because they are few and far between, or the occupants of the encampments have mental health or substance use disorders, or have tried working in the housing system and have not been successful in it. So the one thing I want to note is that what makes sense to me is for the city to align its policy in coordination with the continuum of care. And it's important to also note that the continuum of care, if you agree with that concept, the continuum of care has a couple of goals. One is that homelessness should be rare, brief, and non-recurring. And of course, encampments are not brief, and they are recurring. So we really have a failure of meeting that goal of the continuum of care. Secondly, the continuum of care feels very strongly that homelessness should not be criminalized. That will lead to, further negative outcomes for that person. Typically, if they just move into the criminal justice system somehow, and usually they're expensive. It's expensive for the community as well as for the individual. So it's important to treat every individual with dignity and respect in accordance with their rights. They are residents of the city. But recognize that, really homelessness is very much entwined in the larger societal issues. And so it's hard to pull it out as a separate issue. And you'll see this as we think through the policy. It's hard to say there's one right solution that solves everything, because like probably 100 communities across the US, they're facing the same issue. And I assure you, nobody has found the absolute successful response yet. So we're in good company in that regard. What the continuum of care thinks is a good approach to the issue is to expand housing first options, which are housing opportunities that have no preconditions for getting into the housing. They find it's much more successful when there is housing provided for somebody to work through the issues that they have, and that without housing, getting back on your feet is much, much harder. But so the recommendation that's in this document, about 8 pages, and I apologize, there was a little Google Doc editing that included a couple of duplications that I'll take out in the next round of this. But really, it looks at the options that are available to a city to manage encampments. And, they fall into 4 major categories. There's clearance with no support, which is a no tolerance policy. Clearance with some support when you have housing options available to provide them or other choices for them. Tacit acceptance, in which you don't really address the issue in any direct way. And fourth, formal sanction encampments. Communities usually follow one of these primarily, but they often, dabble in mixing a few components of the other ones. Right now, I'd say that the city is in the tacit acceptance phase of our policy, but really it's not a policy at all, because it's never been publicly adopted. It has not been clear. It's not clearly communicated to city staff what the policy is. And that's one of the problems, I think, is city staff doesn't know what the correct response should be to these instances. The police get some directions at one point, then Department of Public Works gets another direction. The planning office might have some direction. So nobody has a real focused approach to this issue, because it's a real treated as individual situations come up the best we can. So I'm recommending that the city should think about a policy and should adopt a policy, but recognize that any policy that's adopted really needs to be enforced and be consistently applied to be successful. To adopt a no tolerance policy and then not apply it is going to make things worse, frankly, and likewise, with the other variations. So I'm recommending that in this document that the city consider or I essentially recognize that we don't have enough options to offer to people who are living unsheltered right now in the system, as was mentioned by Lydia in her presentation, and that the kind of permanent supportive housing that might be a supportive really needs to have a lot of support services attached to it to be successful. Otherwise, you'll have returns to homelessness in all likelihood. So recognizing that there is not great choices for everybody in every situation, but also recognizing the responsibilities the city has to manage its own property and to address concerns of neighborhoods. I'm recommending that the city adopt a policy in which it prohibits camping on city property, but applies the implementation and the enforcement of that in a very structured way, which focuses enforcement on those areas of public property that are most sensitive and have the most adverse impacts of camping. natural areas, areas adjacent directly to residents, those kind of examples, and de-emphasize enforcement in those areas where there is less adverse impact or external impacts. So an example of that is the area behind Walmart and Lowe's tends to have fewer neighbors and and less natural sensitive areas than several other areas of the city. Would be one area that I would recommend be considered as a low area for enforcing a prohibition on camping. And there are other areas that are listed in this agreement, in this document, that would be areas to consider for higher priority enforcement. This would have the effect of kind of concentrating encampments in a couple of areas and stopping the dispersion of those encampments. It may not have any impact on the total number, but it would do some concentration. And if encampments are concentrated, they can be better served by service workers and service providers. They can find where people are, and they can develop some sort of services, whether it's bathrooms and hand wash or medical care facilities. It facilitates those kind of enhanced services. Without the city committee, but the city has to be careful, I've learned, to facilitate camping on city property in understanding what the liability of the city is. Because if the city were to formally authorize camping on city property, that comes with some liability risk. If somebody gets hurt on that property, the city takes on a responsibility that those structures would be meeting code requirements, for example. So I think you need to be careful, I think, if you're going to authorize camping anywhere. That's why the policy is recommended that there be a prohibition, but the enforcement be very structured based on careful thinking about what are sensitive areas that should be high priority areas for enforcement and areas of the city that should be lower priority areas. And I would expect that any high priority areas where there is camping would require a program of the city to figure out how to do clearance with responsible advance notice and as much support as possible, and be consistent about it. Again, this issue is that it's natural for somebody who is redirected away from a campsite to eventually to find another location, or as we've seen historically, come back to the same location several months later. And so if that occurs, that we're not making any progress on the issue. So this is a balancing kind of issue, I think, and there's no right answer, and there certainly is no solution that's going to work for everybody, but it would provide time for the continuum of care to expand its offerings, and it's kind of viewed as a transition, that the ultimate goal being that there would be enough offerings in the continuum of care system where there would be good choices for people other than camping on city property. So in that respect, the final component here is that I strongly encourage the city to try to be proactive in trying to expand the system and the options available. Because what Liddy didn't mention is that the continuum of care gets a total of $240,000 a year from HUD. They're not going to be able to solve it by themselves. The not-for-profit agencies, for the most part, are the ones who develop the projects that meet the needs of people who are experiencing homelessness. And I think if we wanted to advance this in a timely way, it would be important for the city to consider what resources it can provide to support a not-for-profit. And I suggest that the city issue, perhaps in conjunction with the county, issue a request for expressions of interest to not-for-profits to see what interest there is out there and what needs they would require to advance their project. We have some pretty strong not-for-profits that are looking at different projects, but in almost all cases, land is a problem for them to get a site. Utilities can be a problem in many cases. And I think tides can be viewed as one of those options that are out there that can address some of the need in the community, because you have some familiarity with that proposal. But again, I think it's really important that we work on this as a twin focus. One is managing city property and a kind of a humanistic way to recognize that there's many of these people are in desperate and vulnerable situations, but also to look at how we can expand the continuum. And I'll stop with that. Answer
Thank you, Nels. Thanks so much. Patrick, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was hoping if we could just explain for the public in the policy, in the, sorry, resolution itself, where we have the whereas that Common Council procedures allow for reports to be accepted, endorsed, or adopted. If we could just explain what each three of those mean and why we're suggesting here to accept it.
I don't know if I know it by heart. Do you know, Lisa?
Yeah, accepting the policy means that council acknowledges receipt and thanks the author of the policy. It does not endorse, but rather accepts what has been submitted and thanks, in this case, Nels, the author of.
Perfect. That's my question. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? George, hi, thanks for joining us.
You're muted, George.
Thank you. And Nels, I really appreciate how hard you've worked on this, and Cynthia as well. This may be a stupid question, but in keeping with the idea that some areas are more important than others in terms of where people camp, can we make conditions based on certain behaviors? For example, could we ban a person who is camping on city property and has a meth lab? Or a person who is creating so much trash that it's an environmental hazard to the creek? Things like that, to basically encourage better camping.
I think the policy could incorporate some of those issues. I don't know if Ari's still here. I was, you want to make sure that your policies that you adapt are not in any way discriminatory or addressing fair housing issues in a negative way, or other kind of fairness issues. But I do think there could be criteria based on behavior, could be another approach to it. But again, remember that the policy is to prohibit suggested policies prohibit camping on city property. It's a matter of enforcement. So it's how do you deploy your enforcement activities? And I think you could establish criteria that put higher priority in enforcement when there are instances of some of the behaviors you mentioned.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about, and also repetitive theft and trafficking of people.
Yeah, I do think you want to think about how in practice you're going to make those determinations in a way that provides for some opportunity for appeal or something when it's not, when there's some question about whether that, I'm just trying to, there should be some good evidence, I guess, to draw that conclusion.
I see what you mean. Well, if, for example, if somebody's been arrested several times at one store in a week, the police would know who they are. If there's a huge collection of garbage at their campsite, that's self-evident. A lot of the complaints I get from residents are based on not just camping, but harassment and garbage. So that's why I brought it up. I realize it's complicated.
I think you could create clear criteria that would guide how to deploy enforcement priorities. I think that is a possibility.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think also, George, you said complicated, and I'll just add that this is a very complicated and complex issue to address, and it does not have easy answers. It does not have single responses, and I think that's what's helpful to read in Nels's report. We have some options, but it's very challenging to enforce. We don't have a clear policy right now. There's been just tacit acceptance. Cynthia, I see your hand, and then Phoebe.
Thank you. I think George has kind of touched on some of my underlying concerns without clear direction as to what locations we're going to allow camping and what locations we aren't. To say we have high priority areas, but if you're not in a high priority area, then it might be allowed. There's by design, you would have an area that doesn't have access to resources. It's not going to have access to perhaps emergency vehicles. If there were a fire, if there was something that occurred on site, you might not even know that someone was there for extended duration of time, in which there might be, not only trash that people are talking about, but of course, I'm going to assume human feces and others, because you don't have sanitation support. So I am concerned about, without a clear direction, there might be dispersal, individuals who sort of set up in hidden little spaces that if they feel that nobody can see them, if they don't draw attention to them, then they'll be allowed because they aren't in a very visible space. And do we really want to allow that? Is that acceptable if a police officer sees them or someone sees them and says, well, this is a low priority space, so we're just going to allow this to continue. And then you may discover a tremendous amount of environmental damage at the site. So I am very cautious about that. When we do have, and I think George is hinting to this, one of the challenges that these unsanctioned encampment sites create is they become camouflage for illegal activities. And I don't draw a necessary association that it's the individual who's living there that's doing this, but I do believe solidly that individuals who are engaging in illegal activities will run off into this area and get lost, and do things there, whether or not it's manufacturing or chop shops about bicycles, or I have no idea if they live there or not. But when you have these sites, it covers up a lot of other activities. So that's another reason that I'm very reluctant to have an uncontrolled approach to unsanctioned encampments. Going back to emergency responses, if someone is in a place that nobody knows about, there's a fire, a neighbor calls, there's a fire. Well, where do you send them to? Well, I don't know. They're in the bushes over here and there's no address. And you could have emergency crews going around in circles and then not able to actually get into that area. That's another reason. So I do caution that. I would support, I think, being very explicit if you are going to allow this, where is it you're going to allow it? Rather than sort of here's a high priority, but everything else is low priority area. But other than that, I fully support this proposal for a myriad of reasons. And I'm very grateful that we are having this conversation. It is long overdue. And I'm glad to see us moving forward on this.
Yeah, agreed. And this too, when we vote on it tonight, would then go on to council for the larger council discussion. Any other comments? Rob?
Yeah, just picking up on Cynthia's point. So I just want to make sure I understand that the policy that we're moving forward is not specifically identifying, it's just making possible that we then can have a plan that identifies certain areas as high or low. Is that, am I understanding that correctly? Or because we're not looking at the specifics of location at this through this
No.
policy, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, the resolution tonight is to accept this policy. It is not to endorse this policy
Or accept
or
the
its
report.
recommendations.
Got it. Yep.
And so just for clarification, by accepting the policy doesn't mean we actually are having a policy. We're just accepting the report, right? We're accepting this piece of paper, but
Correct.
we still don't have a policy.
Yeah, it's a
Right.
report. Right.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Phoebe, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did, but I think the question was kind of answered, and I think Niels, again, what it sounds like you're saying is that what we do is some of these encampments, okay, some of them the city will say, okay, like you talked about the one behind Lowe's and Walmart, where there are not a lot of apartments and houses and stuff, right? So this is talking about having some enforced, some of the work that I believe Cynthia talked about, building out in these encampments. Are these together some kind of way? In the last meeting, we talked about with the what's his name? With the St. John's and so I mean, this is what we're like okay and kind of, we're not okay in that, but this is just to have the discussion when we all come together and that sort of included.
Right. I would encourage to linking the policy from potential solutions, because there could be several different things, and there's probably no single solution that's going to solve the problem. So there needs to be a myriad number of approaches or multiple approaches.
Okay.
That's my recommendation.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful clarification too. Any other comments or questions? Okay.
If I could, I know that Tom Parsons has been working on homeless issues for years now. If he could share any thoughts that he might have on what is being proposed here, or the report that's being proposed.
Yeah, I think having a policy is important, at least gives you some framework, but it sounds like what you're doing here is just accepting the report, and council accept the report. I don't see anything changing unless you're actually going to enforce or establish the policy and start enforcement. My concern is, well, I'll just be blunt. I don't think anything gets fixed with this. We're still going to have homelessness in places that are going to be hard to reach. We're going to continue to have fires. We're going to have medical emergencies in very remote areas, which we do now. And there's going to be still more environmental damage done to a lot of what was natural areas, but now is pretty much contaminated with trash and debris and waste. And I don't see anything getting better without actually adopting and implementing the policy. And even there, oops, sorry, office like no movement. I just don't know where you go from here. The supportive services, to be successful, the people have to reach them. But some people, if they're allowed to go into the in the areas out behind, I'll give you where out behind Home Depot or Buffalo Wild Wings, where they can get very, very secluded and live back there. And then we have large amount of rain and we have flooding down there, and people in their homelessness camps get washed out. We can't access them, we can't help them. And then we hear a cry from the advocates saying, what are you doing for them? Well, we didn't even know they were there. So I'm not necessarily saying that things are going to get worse, but I don't see any change without actually adopting the policy and implementing it, and defining the areas where it's going to be permitted and the areas where we're going to try to encourage people not to have encampments.
Yeah, I'll just say we don't have a policy on the table. I think the presentation from Lydia and Simone and this report once again highlights the complexity of this issue. Nell's was, I heard one recommendation that perhaps the city and county should partner and work together to expand continuum of care programs, the recommendations that we heard from Simone and Liddy tonight. That is something that we could be discussing and potentially moving forward with, simultaneously developing a policy, but we don't have a policy. If we had a policy, we have to really think about enforcement, and that opens up further complexities and challenges. So, Tom.
One challenge for the folks moving out of homelessness into housing is that they've lived without a home for so long. They have developed skills to survive, but those skills are not adaptive to going into organized housing. This is problems what we've seen over at Art House, people that have moved in there that just don't have any support services to help them organize. We just had a fire up on 209 Elmwood last week, where somebody who moved in there, it was a large hoarding situation, and the person was, just did not have the skills to be organized. And not only did the fire displace him, but it displaced one of his neighbors. And it is a very sad situation. It was an accidental fire. The sprinkler took care of it, but the damage from the water, as well as the apartment just being filled with a tremendous amount of collected belongings, just made it, uninhabitable in its condition when we arrived. Even before the fire happened, it was probably uninhabitable for folks that would be living in normal organized housing. So there's a gap that needs to be filled, that people need to be prepared to live in that environment. And I think what Liddy mentioned, but I don't think we've really gone into it, is how many people get into housing and then come right back out and go into homelessness because they can't survive in that environment. They're not prepared. There's no services to help them.
Well, and it's that supportive services that I heard Liddy and Simone talk about, the tremendous need for. If there's not the wraparound services, if there's not the housing navigator to intense case management, then it is more likely to see people return to homelessness. Yeah. George, I'm sorry, I see your hand. Nels, did you want to jump in first?
Excuse me. I was just going to mention that based on Chief Parsons' comments, that really I think this report should be viewed as a opportunity to discuss the issues and figure out among the council members what you think is the best policy. There's no clear right answer here, but it is important to give guidance to city staff how you want to respond to these issues. And I think the tacit acceptance approach is really not going to benefit the community or the city. And I expect we will see an expansion of encampments if we continue to follow tacit acceptance. There is an opportunity once a year in April when the cold weather policy ends And that's a very opportune time because people are moving from kind of the emergency shelter cold weather policy where they're typically moving into hotel rooms and moving back out during the summer into encampments. And that's a time when there can be some, real impact on how, or an influence on what happens with those people and where they go. So it's something to keep in mind if you're thinking about a timeline at all. April is a good time to have a policy that's ready to be implemented because it can have a much greater impact on the encampments.
Yeah, thanks, Nels, for that reminder. And that is, I think, what we're seeing is an incredible increase in encampments. George, sorry, you had your hand up, and then Cynthia.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I agree with both Nels and Tom. In order to make things better, we need a policy. And in order to discourage certain types of behavior that are dangerous, we need enforcement. That may not be optically the best thing to do, but in order to change behavior, we need enforcement. And services. And we can't keep doing what we're doing now. We can't just say, gee, this is a complicated problem and then do nothing. It's really at a crisis level right now. And the people at Nate's Floral Estates and the businesses in that on Cherry Street are really suffering every day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, George. Cynthia?
Yeah, I know we keep talking about wraparound services, and I know we're talking about case management. I think the other element that really does need to be provided for individuals to be successful in housing is education and training. Chief Parsons talked about hoarding. There's other behaviors, the skills you need to survive unhoused, like hoarding. You don't have the skills you need to survive in an apartment, like knowing to shut off the stove, knowing to not allow your toilet and your bathtub to overflow and then therefore flood the unit and the unit below. How do you manage keys so that you're not letting outside people into an apartment complex? There are so many skills that individuals have lost, I think perhaps due to a myriad of factors. But there's an intensity to that, which I think supportive housing would help. But in terms of case management and just outreach into the encampments, I don't know how you train people in those areas. So I think that needs to be part of the conversation. Chris Teitelbaum mentions this explicitly over and over again as one of the benefits that he sees Tides offering is being able to provide that one-on-one education process to help people. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, as the city adopts a policy, when we get to that point, I think an essential component not only is partnership with the county, but partnership with outreach workers, because what we don't want to have is a policy that is enforced by city staff, but outreach workers then perhaps enabling individuals to be unhoused in inappropriate locations by providing materials or propane tanks or things like that run counter to what we are trying to achieve. So I think that is as important as partnership with the county, and of course, getting their support for any program. Having a program that gains their support is essential to our success.
Thank you. Phoebe, go ahead.
I agree with Cynthia. I believe Chris, when he spoke with us the last time, he spoke about many of the people. So I was just thinking in my head, like I came here in 1993 and the jungle was there then. So this is not new, these encampments and people, a lot of these people choose to be there. It's not that, so we really need a lot of that education piece of, taking steps of bringing people out. So we also had the gentleman on here. Yeah, but this is just policy tonight. I don't even know why I'm having this long discussion, but yeah, because this is just yeah. But excuse me, I was thinking about what Chris talked about, and there are some things in place. So what I'm thinking about is when we say enforcing, will those type of things be things that people would have to be doing to even if we allow this? Yeah. I'm getting loopy now.
Yeah, enforcement, I think it's a lot to consider. But first, we should have a discussion, and not just discuss, but look to move forward with a policy. So what we're doing tonight. Yes, Cynthia.
Just if I may, because I know we use the word enforcement, and there's just the word has a heavy hand to it. Phoebe, when I heard about what Missoula, Montana had done, when they talk about enforcement, they go out into a community, they see an encampment, and their first interaction is like, I see you're here, there are options, let me tell you about them. I'm going to come back tomorrow, we need to move you off this property, but we're going to work with you to help you. So that's how they talk about enforcement. I think that's a great model that I think we could explore. I'm not seeing anyone looking at this as criminalizing homelessness. So enforcement doesn't mean a ticket. It means working compassionately with an individual to try to get them to a more appropriate location. So I don't have a better term than enforcement, but that's what I think about when we talk about enforcement.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Good point. Enforcing compassion. Yeah, that's a thumbs up from George. All right. Are we ready to vote then on this proposed resolution? And again, it is a resolution to accept the proposed policy report. Okay, all those in favor? And I'm sure we'll have a very fulsome, and that passes 5-0, thank you. And I'm sure we'll have a very fulsome discussion at council as well. And thank you, Nels, for your work on this. It's extremely helpful.
You're welcome.
All right. Do we have April minutes for review? Okay. We've had lengthy meetings, and so it takes some time to get minutes in order. We'll have them the next time. Patrick, are you making a motion to adjourn?
I'm making a motion to adjourn.
Okay. And Rob seconds that. All in favor of adjourning? Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good work. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.